Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is our second Otto Preminger event. I guess I'll come back to that in just a second. But my name is Pete Timmerman. I'm the director of the Webster University Film Series. As a quick intro to the film series, I imagine all of you are familiar with who we are and what we do by now, but just to make sure, the Webster University Film Series is St. Louis's only year-round nonprofit cinema. We've been in operation for 42 years. We're housed on Webster University's main campus in St. Louis, Missouri, in Winifred Moore Auditorium, which is part of Webster Hall. Under the normal run of things, we show movies in Winifred Moore, usually between like 3 and 5 times a week, but it's spotty. It's a shared space, so I don't just get full run of whatever I want to do with it all the time. But since the pandemic hit, we haven't done anything in person at all. So it's been, what, 15 months now since we've had any in-person screenings. In that time, we've been doing a lot of virtual programming on both films and discussions like what you're attending tonight. We'll be resuming in-person screenings probably mid to late August. We're working on the details of that now, but we've got a few more virtual events coming, and I wanted to make sure you were aware of them. So I'll start there. We've been keeping things in what we've been calling a virtual cinema. That's the stuff that we would program in person if we could, but under the current circumstances where we can't have in-person screenings, we've been working with the distributors to host them online instead. You rent the films just like you would, like VOD style. It usually costs between $10 and $12 to rent any given film, and then we get half the proceeds. But they're first-run films, generally not available elsewhere aside from just other nonprofit movie theaters around the country. But yeah, so like first-run art house, independent foreign films, also sometimes new restorations of older films. For the past 15 months, we've usually had about 1 new film in the virtual cinema per week, but that's kind of in the process of changing right now to where like 2 weeks ago, we didn't have any new films, and last week had 4 all at once, and this week we don't have any again. So there's no new openings in the virtual cinema tomorrow, but currently in the virtual cinema, they all opened last week, and they're all going to play for at least another week, if not longer. We have 4 titles. Those 4 in brief, there's a Bosnian coming-of-age movie called Take Me Somewhere Nice. There's a compilation of short films by young BIPOC directors called Who Will Start Another Fire. There is Hong Sang-soo, the very prolific South Korean director. Hong Sang-soo's second film, The Power of Gangwon Province, is in there. That's from 1998, but it's only now, it's got a new restoration and a new subtitle translation. So they're giving it a bigger push than it historically gotten in North America in the past. And then there's a new American independent film called Slow Machine that stars Elmer Friedberger of the Fiery Furnaces, if you're familiar with that band. But yeah, you can access any of those films. Our main website is webster.edu/film series. You can also follow us on social media. On Instagram and Twitter, we're at WU Film Series, and on Facebook, we're at Webster Film Series. But the links to rent the films and all the instructions and everything you need are on our website and on social media. So if you want to check them out there, please do. In terms of coming speakers, this month's Otto Preminger series is going to be our last one for now. We're not going to do a featured filmmaker in July like what we've been doing. We started this monthly auteur series in February. But yeah, Preminger is going to be it for the time being. In July, we're going to take time, we being the film series office, just me and Jessica Pierce. We're going to regroup and plan for reopening in person. I haven't ruled out the possibility of doing virtual events sometimes because they've been popular. We've gotten good attendance and good feedback on them. So thank you all for supporting us in this time. And like I said, I don't want to take for granted that everyone's been so supportive of these events. So we'll kind of figure it out in July what we're going to do going forward. But for now, the last couple of virtual events you have to look forward to is a week from tonight, we have Robert Garrick on Anatomy of a Murder. Robert Garrick is an attorney and he's a cinephile. If you attend Cinema St. Louis events with any regularity, you've probably seen him speak. He's a favorite speaker of Cliff Fralick at Cinema St. Louis. So we're happy to have him next week. And then some of you tried to attend last week's event with Renee Thomas Woods on Carmen Jones. That was postponed. We do have a new date if you haven't seen it. It's going to happen on July 1st, which is a Thursday. So it's just the next Thursday. It's 2 weeks from today. So yeah, the last 2 events are going to be Robert Garrick on Anatomy of a Murder and Renee Thomas Woods on Carmen Jones. And then there won't be anything for a month, maybe longer. Like I said, we'll kind of figure it out at that point. If you've missed any of these programs and you want to catch up with them, we do have a YouTube channel now. If you go to YouTube and just search Webster University Film Series, you'll find us. All the videos pop up about a week after they happen. So if you want to recommend Victor's presentation to someone tonight, just look for it about a week from now. It'll pop up at that time. I guess one last thought before I hand the floor over to Victor is that after Victor's presentation, we'll have time for a question answer discussion type of period. If you want to put any questions you have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time, I appreciate that from the moderator, and it kind of makes it the transition from the presentation into Q&A go a little smoother. Also, I didn't write a lot of questions tonight. I tend to have a whole bunch, and I have very few tonight. So I'm probably going to need some assistance from those of you in the audience with good, smart questions. But yeah, so I'm happy to welcome Victor Putinier, which I hope it's going to be glaringly apparent that I do not speak French, so I apologize for any grievous errors that I say over the course of this next hour. But Victor is a PhD student at WashU in French language and literature. He's a friend of a friend. We've kind of met here and there, but I'm happy to. I've actually seen him do one of these presentations before, and I was thrilled with it. So I'm happy to bring him around to the Webster Film Series to talk about the Preminger film Bonjour Tristesse. With that, Victor, if you want to take over.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Pete, for having me. I'm a long-time listener / viewer and first-time speaker, so it's a pleasure to be here today. Let's just dive right in. So, as many people, I think, know, Bonjour Tristesse was adapted from a novel, but the novel that it was adapted from had a very important, I think, predecessor, which was The Devil in the Flesh by Raymond Radiguet. Raymond Radiguet was a very young author. He published this novel in 1923, and the film was adapted in 1947. Radiguet was Jean Cocteau's protégé, and this book was very, very famous and scandalous for a lot of reasons that are relevant to our topic today. So The Devil in the Flesh tells the story of a 15-year-old boy who develops an adulterous relationship with a married woman whose husband is fighting in World War I. Raymond Radiguet was 20 at the time of publication, and yes, the novel is autobiographical. So it was obviously a huge scandal because a lot of the veterans from World War I that had finished just 5 years before the book was published were really scandalized. But since Raymond Radiguet died the year the book was published, there was no real consequences for him. Maybe it's for the best. And when Bonjour Tristesse was published in 1954, Françoise Sagan was 18, and the novel had the same kind of scandalous reception as Radiguet's novel had. And she was extensively compared to Raymond Radiguet. For instance, François Mauriac, who is a French writer, very famous French Catholic writer who was also a closeted gay man, but that's a conversation for another day. He criticized the novel for its display of, I quote, teenage feminine debauchery. And he started such an aggressive campaign against her that it granted her immediate success. And the book was thus very, very, it got very, very famous. It got read by a lot of people, a lot of young adults and teenagers. And I think that we can see that from Radiguet to Sagan, we have this kind of trend in French intellectual life and French literature of this kind of trend of very young writers who explore controversial and quote unquote adult topics. And there's this, in this exploration of adulthood through literature, they kind of try to learn how to be adults by writing about what they consider to be adult things. And there's really this is kind of with Radiguet and then Françoise Sagan, this kind of trend of exploration of teenage sexuality by teenage writers. So I think it's really important to know that the novel itself is the work of an author who completely identifies with Cécile, the character. And my question would be, what does Preminger make of this? I'm not going to go into too much detail about the differences between the book and the film. I'm just going to mention the basic differences and how they're relevant to what Preminger wants us to see. While the incestuous subtext is present in the novel, it's never made completely explicit, or at least not as explicit as in the movie. We have to keep in mind that Françoise Sagan was very young when she wrote and published the book. She was probably aware of the Electra complex at play in her novel, but she did not seem to wish to explore it as openly as Preminger does. One of the key reasons for that would probably be the fact that her publisher, René Julliard, who was known for always finding young talents, probably knew that he had a scandalous book in his hand, but he maybe did not want to push the scandal too much. It would be hard to, push the incestuous relationship too much further. However, Preminger is older, more mature, and he sees what any older reader of Bonjour Tristesse, the book, would have seen, and he decides to show it to us. I think this shot is particularly revealing. We have the outfits that are matching, like a lot of couples do, like this couple thing. They are leaning in for a kiss, and they always kiss on the mouth throughout the entire movie. She always calls him Raymond. She always calls her own father Raymond. And at some point, Elsa says to both of them, "You don't even need words. The perfect marriage." It's a quote that is not in the book and that Preminger added in the screenplay to kind of emphasize this idea. So Preminger is much more heavy-handed than Françoise Sagan because I would argue that he doesn't necessarily have the choice. You can excuse the source material for not highlighting those things, but the adaptation, if it wants to kind of be like the film adaptation, if it wants to be taken seriously, it needs to be a little bit more explicit. And I'll come back to this notion of adulthood and seriousness because I think it's very, very important. As a consequence, however, on the film itself, Preminger really emphasizes Cécile's childishness. Throughout the movie, she shows a lot of like superstitions, and she believes in a bunch of like numbers, like 7 and 3. It's something that was added from the book. And there's this very funny chalkboard scene, which is not in the book, where we can see that Jean Seberg's character compares herself to Anne, the new girlfriend of her father. And this is something that was added in from the book, because in the book, we have much more a focus on Cécile comparing Elsa and Anne, but not as much herself to Anne. And she's also she's much more trying to be an adult, to look like an adult. And this is a very childish thing that the character would not be doing. So because of this childishness, I think it's important to talk about family structure. Preminger has a very interesting take on family structures. I think it's one of his key features in terms of screenwriting and writing families is that he loves absent mothers. I think that for him, it opens a kind of playground of possibilities in terms of interactions and dramatic tensions. So for those of you who are familiar with Preminger's filmography, can you think of one film that has a prominent mother or mother figure? I found it pretty hard. The only one that I could think was one of his last movies, Skidoo, in which the mother character played by Carol Channing is very prominent. But the thing is, not only there's no father, so already, I mean, the father is in jail for most of the film, so we don't really have an actual like parent couple. And also, her first big scene is her basically being in a form of competition with her daughter for a sexual partner. So we have a very strong imbalance already. And so since there's no mother, however, we always have a father figure in these like kind of family dramas or family comedies that Preminger makes. Coincidentally, Bonjour Tristesse is Preminger's third feature where David Niven plays the role of a father/father figure with more than fatherly interest in the main female character. It starts in 1944 with Laura, and it continues in 1953 with The Moon is Blue, in which I would say that in terms of family format, it would be the comedy counterpart of Bonjour Tristesse, in the sense that we also have this widower, or maybe divorced, I don't really remember, this single man who is a father, but whose daughter is part of the film, but who also has this weird father/lover interest towards the main female character. So what would be the consequences of this absence of mother figure in terms of the plot? Well, I think it's very important to see that there's very much a non-traditional family model at play. Cécile even calls herself, when she meets her lover Philippe for the first time, she calls herself and her own father, those wicked people from Paris. There's this playful awareness of not fitting the traditional family ideal. And there's always a strange triangle, which we see here. We see here Elsa, who is the first girlfriend that David Niven's character has, and we have Cécile sitting on the bed with him. So there's always this triangle. There's never just a couple. This shot is very interesting in understanding. It's very helpful to understand the imbalance that is always at play in the family relationship. We see that we have three people. On the far left, we have the current girlfriend. That is, she doesn't really have lines in the film. She's just here to, be here. We have Cécile, who's already smoking, but we have Raymond, who is giving a cigarette to his girlfriend. And of course, there's the heavy sexual metaphor here, but also I would say that a cigarette is a symbol of his affection that he is splitting both with his daughter and his girlfriend that he has at the time. And there's always this, kind of constant triangle, because as both Cécile and Raymond are looking for partners throughout the movie, they always share details of their intimate relationships with each other. They have a very codependent relationship. And one line that I think deserves our attention is when Cécile learns that her father wants to marry Anne, she says, well, if he's glad, I'm glad. And it is a proof of love and of support, but it's also the fact that they cannot really feel like whatever one feels, the other will feel, because they are so close to each other. And this closeness manifests itself in like the hedonism and the constant quest for freedom. Hedonism is kind of the value upheld by Raymond and therefore Cécile. What they do with their time is, their main activities are spending money, drinking alcohol, gambling, and sex. And there's an obsession that is often verbalized by Cécile about having a good time. And there's one of the first serious conversations between Raymond and Anne is about the question of playmates when referring to lovers. Love and sex are always considered a game, and there's always this quest for the game. And what is lying kind of under this quest for game, for playing, is a very strong rejection of the traditional family model that appears from the very first scene when Cécile proposes to her dog as a way of ridiculing the seriousness of marriage. But a little bit later, Elsa, who when Raymond leaves the casino with Anne, which is the first hint of Raymond and Anne getting closer, Elsa's reaction is, I think, very telling. She says, "I will not be treated like a wife." Marriage is really considered a form of obstacle to hedonism and to this kind of free lifestyle. Marriage is the end. So what Anne's interruption really brings into the film to me, it's the fact that she is trying very hard to be a mother figure at the same time as she's trying to be a lover, but not just a lover, she's also trying to be a wife. And one of the very first things that's very obvious as she arrives at the villa is at the mansion is, well, she is the moral compass of the movie, really, and she has this kind of moral compass that clashes very strongly with Raymond and Cécile's lifestyle. Interestingly enough, she is the only character that takes Cécile for what she is, which is a child, and she feels a sort of responsibility towards her as an adult. Specifically, it's something that is much more explored in the novel, in the fact that Cécile spent her childhood after her mother's death in a convent, and when she got out of the convent at age 15 or 16, it was Anne who welcomed her and who kind of eased her back into society. And Anne was one of her mother's best friends, and she was probably her mother's closest friend. So she's really trying to make Cécile into a nice, responsible woman. The thing is that we really have a fight of the Pygmalions here, because Raymond wants Cécile to be free. She spent her childhood in a convent, and he wants her to have fun like he has fun. while Anne wants Cécile to study for her philosophy exams, and she criticized very severely the influence that Raymond's friends have over Cécile. The beautiful Givenchy gowns that we have in the film that are inside the diegesis, they are made by Anne. They're very much part of this attempt at fashioning Cécile almost like a doll. She is when Anne shows up, she is trying to take over she's trying to take control over Cécile, and I think this shot is very telling. We see Anne who's holding Cécile's arm, and she's grabbing her at first very aggressively. She's pulling her back to her, but there's also something loving as the shot continues. We see that she's also holding her, like literally holding her and trying to be supportive to her. And I think it's a good moment to include some of the facts about the off-screen Pygmalion situation that happened between Otto Preminger and Jean Seberg. So as most people know, he kind of found her in her Iowa hometown. He's the one who gave her signature. I mean, he didn't cut her hair, but he's the one who decided that she would have this kind of pixie haircut that became her signature look. It's a haircut that was only supposed to last just for Saint Joan, which was their first film together. But then she kept it. She was forced to keep it / encouraged to. And it was rumored that during filming, Otto Preminger and Jean Seberg were having an affair. And it was, I mean, the film itself was very sexual, but the outside context of it was very sexual. And also, although she denied it, a lot of film scholars agreed to say that it never happened, and I believe that it didn't happen. But the thing is, rumors tend to spread very quickly. And when it happened, her dad bought all of the newspaper in his little hometown where he was still living, and he burned them down in order to make sure the rumor would not reach anyone in the town. So, there's this scandalous thing at play, very much at play behind. And I think it's just interesting the way everybody in the film and outside of the film are trying to make Cécile / Jean Seberg into what they want her to be. So this, not yet. This general kind of imbalance that we observe between Cécile and her father is really very much disturbed by Anne's arrival and the various injunctions to adulthood that are thrown at Cécile, and she also kind of throws these injunctions at herself. She's desperately trying to be an adult, also while still being very much a child. And I think when you've lived your entire childhood in a convent and then discovered true boundless freedom, I think it's you're kind of bound to not necessarily being very mature about it. And it's something that's very obvious in her character. She has this playfulness turned deadly that manifests itself in the fact that when she is asked to be an adult, she acts the way she thinks adults do, and it's something that the book really emphasizes on. And so she plays with adults' feeling and the way she plays with them, because as a child, she only knows how to play and not how to be serious. This playfulness leads to a tragedy. And there's very much a problem of communication at play here that I think is very important. It's Anne herself who says when she meets Elsa, and I think it's Raymond who's trying to make sense of the situation for her. And she says explanations make everything more complicated. And so we have this refusal of communication that will in turn create this danger that would result in the end where Anne dies in a car accident. And I think it's interesting to see how Anne is perceived by Cécile as a role model. For instance, she says at some point that she wishes she was like her, both in terms of the way she behaves, the way she walks, how smart she is. But immediately she barely has the time to finish the sentence that Anne shows up and tries to interrupt her relationship with Philippe, who is her summer boyfriend. And there's an immediate conflict that results in Anne's death from this confrontation. So Anne is really the ultimate mother figure. Cécile wants to be her, but she also wants to get rid of her. And I think in her death, Anne is really the ultimate mother figure in the sense that she's very nurturing, because she lets Raymond and Cécile believe that her death was an accident. she died in a car crash after all, and she didn't leave a note or anything, and she died taking a turn in the most dangerous road in the country. And so there's this nurturing thing where even when she dies, she still makes sure that there's no proof that it was intentional. And I think the seriousness and kind of adultness of her death clashes with that one scene when Raymond and Cécile are trying to write a letter to get her to come back. I'm not very good with Freud and Lacan, so I'm not going to develop this too much about like, the mother leaving or whatever. This is not my specialty. I'm very bad at psychoanalysis, but I'll just say this. They try to get her back in a very childish way. Like maybe if we tell mom we love her, she will come back to us. But this attempt is, it will only be a failure because she is already dead as they try to write the letter. And this Anne's death is actually something that that plays a very big importance in the question of time. Raymond and Cécile just want to have fun. They are locked in this cycle of hedonism that Anne tries to put an end to by trying to marry Raymond. And marriage, as I've said before, is perceived as this really frightening ending. It's a sudden jump into adulthood, both for Cécile and Raymond. And they don't want to escape from this vicious cycle of debauchery, to quote François Mauriac, in this debauchery that they are really like kind of stuck into. So they are in this cyclical, in this circular time, like the repetition of like going from lover to lover, and then during the summer they go to the beach and then they come back to Paris. But the last line is, to me, very, very important because Cécile says, I want to forget, but I can't. And basically Cécile is trapped into linear time at this moment because she is not in the cycle of debauchery anymore, of like, very light debauchery with no worrying about the future. Because she has memories, painful ones too, like very painful memories, she is forced to face the passing of time. And this is therefore why adulthood becomes a prison for her. This is a really interesting shot because this is when we realize that what has been shot in black and white, what has been shot was actually shot in colors, and then the colors were removed. And you can see that in the top left corner, you see the sea that is blue. I hope you can see it. You see the sea that is blue. And that is, it's fading. It's taking this shot takes time to fade into another one. Like we see really the way before was in color and now it's in black and white. The colors, the happiness has been drained by Anne's death. Yet they are still in this cycle of fun, but they're sad because they are now adults and they are stuck in this cycle that Anne tried to interrupt. And the only thing that Anne managed to do was just make them sad, like make them sad adults that try to keep going in this debauchery without even, taking any happiness from it. And so I think this picture of Jean Seberg looking at us is a very good segue into my next section, which is on looks and looking. One of Preminger's signature filmmaking devices is this kind of stage-like screen. So Preminger was, he came from theater initially when he lived in Europe, and then when he moved to Hollywood, he switched to filmmaking, but he was still very much a theater person. He was a theater director. He tried to, at least up until the 50s, he tried to spend 6 months of every year just directing plays. And it's something that's very, very obvious in his filmmaking, in the sense that the camera rarely locks characters in. He uses a lot of long shots, and he kind of lets the characters' interaction be at the heart of each scene. And in an interview by Jacques Rivette that Jacques Rivette did with Preminger for Les Cahiers du Cinéma in 1953, Preminger basically says, well, there's no difference between directing on stage and directing from behind a camera. For him, it's the same thing. Even the mannerisms of the actors have to be the same on camera, which I think he's exaggerating, but also it makes sense in terms of understanding his filmmaking. I think this screenshot is really, really interesting because I took it from a very long shot in which we see the four main characters interacting. We can see here that we have Anne and Elsa interacting. Anne is judging Elsa because Elsa doesn't have the taste that Anne has. She doesn't have the same sense of fashion, and she's also more vulgar. So there's very much this, class thing happening. Anne being the embodiment of this very rich cultural bourgeoisie, intellectual bourgeoisie, and because she's a clothes designer. And you have Elsa, who's much more maybe like the new rich. She belongs to the new rich category. So we have this judging happening. And if you look closely, you can, don't have to look closely to see that, but you can see that Cécile is looking at Elsa worryingly, and Raymond is looking at Anne. And throughout the entire section of this shot, when we have the four characters together, Raymond is looking at Anne, and then he's looking away. So basically, it's very much a game of looks. And this long shot and all the long shots that Preminger uses, they allow us to look at the screen to kind of walk our gaze on each face. On each face, we have to really, decipher them and see how they interact with one another. And I think that's one of the strengths in Preminger's filmmaking, is that he doesn't want us to just see, he wants us to watch. And he wants us to watch, but not just the screen. He wants us to, imagine the off screen. He wants us to see the off screen. As an illustration of the imbalance in the relationships between the characters, even when we only have two characters on screen, such as here, it's a funny screenshot, but like it's very telling. Even when we only have two characters on screen, there's always at least a third character off screen, whether the characters are looking at him or at her. In this context, we have Elsa and Raymond, who are looking at Cécile, who is swimming to Philippe, whom she has never met, but she just decided that he looked hot, so she swam to him. And they're either looking at a third character or talking about a third character. And so, yeah, this shot really illustrates that. Like, even though we could have just them talking, the first part they're talking about Cécile, and then they are looking at her. So it's like that throughout pretty much the entire movie. And there's also a very, very strong emphasis on being looked at. The space, the way the space is handled in the off-screen and the on-screen is very, very interesting in Preminger's work, and especially in this film, because here we have Cécile and Raymond, who are discussing Anne and Elsa, and they're trying to see who's best, probably. And Cécile is trying to convince her to go back to Elsa in order to make Anne leave. And this is the same shot. Okay, this is just the camera just travels from here to here. It's the same shot, the same scale, and basically, if you see like these bushes in the top left corner, is where Cécile and Raymond were standing before they walked over, almost stepped on them to walk to the other side of the screen. It's interesting how the space that the camera covers is much smaller than we were led to think, and it's a very theatrical thing too. Like you can very much picture this in a stage setting where you would have Raymond and Cécile who are entering the stage, and at some point very technically like physically close to them, you have Philippe and Elsa who are pretending to be sleeping together, and to be asleep together. And in a theatrical performance, it would make sense that they do not see, because they do not see the couple sleeping, because it's part of the the suspension of disbelief. And here it becomes very hard to suspend our disbelief. Like, how could they talk for such a long time and just only see them when they're at their feet? So the question of like being looked at is like of looking and being looked at is very interesting, because here they are even performing being asleep. And they know that it's going to cause Raymond to be very upset and to try to seduce Elsa back, which is what happens here. This is one of my favorite shots of the entire movie. Here we have like the real pleasure of the theatrics. We have the real pleasure of being looked at, doing something you should be doing, this kind of like transgression. This is part of the scene where Elsa just sent a telegram to the house because she didn't want to call on the phone and have her voice being recognized by Raymond. And she calls Cécile to tell her that Raymond has invited her on a date. And here she is wearing a very interesting fashion statement piece, which is this basket that she decided would become a hat. It's very interesting because she says that she's wearing this in order not to be recognized, but the shot prior to that I didn't take a screenshot of, but she is screaming and waving at Cécile. So of course, and also let's just keep in mind that it happens in a small town near the sea. So I think most people know one another, and that she was not discreet at all. But it's not about not being recognized as much as playing not to be recognized. There's this real playfulness in pretending and in lying, and the question of looks is there's really something like both voyeuristic and like in the fact of like, you know, this I want to be seen, I want to watch, and this is basically how the climax of the film develops. Here, so the climax of the film is when right after Elsa told Cécile about this date that was supposed to happen, Cécile decides to let Anne find Raymond and Elsa together. And here we are forced, unlike most of the film where we are allowed to, you know, walk our gaze on the screen, here we are forced to watch Elsa as she is Anne, sorry, as she is looking at Raymond and Elsa. We were forced to look at her face, and we look at her face, but we have to listen to the conversation happening between Elsa and Raymond, this post-coitus conversation where Raymond says, well, I said yes to Anne, I accepted to marry her, but you have to say that to these women. Like there's something very, very dark, very, very misogynistic and very cynical about it. And it's interesting how you have this separation of senses. You have the sight on the one hand and the hearing on the other hand. And the whole film makes us look at bodies. It's a very sensual film. It's very sexual. And we could expect a climax that is both sexual and filming by seeing Raymond and Elsa together in this now adulterous relationship. And that's what I mean by autoeroticism. It's not just a pun it's not just a gratuitous pun, but it's the way Preminger kind of builds up this sexual tension, and we have a lot of very sexual scenes. But here he decides to kind of frustrate us and to make us look at the pain that this sexual relationship has, the pain that it triggers in Anne, and it's very much about, you know, the unseen in this scene. What matters is not what Raymond and Elsa are discussing as much as it is what Anne feels. And as we could expect from a film that is all about looks, Anne is being watched, of course. Cécile is looking at Anne, who is looking at Raymond and Elsa, and we are looking at Cécile. Like, and we were kind of, you know, taken into this play on gazes, which is very, very interesting. And then my interest, one of the things that I think is interesting is how Anne decides to look away at the end. And she doesn't just look away because, you know, she is upset. That I think there's more to that. The way the film ends and the way the book ends also is in Anne refusing to stand this any longer, to take her car and to eventually drive to her death. And interestingly, Cécile's character realizes that she has made a mistake, and she's trying to to fix what cannot be fixed. And she tries to explain, Cécile tries to apologize. And interestingly enough, there's again this refusal of communication, because words will never undo what Anne has seen. And not only is seeing enough for Anne, but it's also like she is closing her eyes because she has seen enough, and she will not listen to Cécile. She will not try to understand. And there's nothing really to be understood, because as much as Cécile feels responsible for what happened, and as much as she would like it to be just a game gone wrong, pain has been caused. So I think it's a very important aspect of the film, this notion of looking and sometimes seeing too much, and how looking is kind of contradicting the question of communication, because Cécile's entire plotting and entire manipulating is about seeing. It's about Raymond seeing Elsa and Philippe together. It's about then Anne seeing Raymond and Elsa together. So it's all about, and everything is semi made up, but it ended up being way too real. As a conclusion, I would like to talk about Jean Seberg's voiceover throughout the entire film. Some people would argue with me. When I first watched the movie, I thought it was one of the weaknesses of it, in the sense that I felt it was kind of too much on the nose. But after rewatching it, I thought it was actually a very, very efficient aspect of the film, because it's, after all, we're watching the movie through the perspective of a child. And if it's kind of heavy-handed, it's because that's how, young people will express their feelings for the first time. They think they've reinvented the wheel by saying these things, but I think they're very interesting. And Cécile is very she verbalizes a lot of her feeling throughout the movie in those voiceovers. But I think the most telling line is the one that is sang by Juliette Gréco, whom I love, and in her song that is the title. The song Bonjour Tristesse, that is the title of the soundtrack, it's the central song of the soundtrack. She says, "I've lost no casual lover, I've lost me." And I think that being an adult, and this is a line that is very much about being an adult and how loving like an adult means self-destruction, and it's the lesson that that Cécile learns. And the phrasing itself, "I lost me," kind of sounds like a child's distraught realization that love is always lost. And that's about it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Victor. Again, a reminder to those of you in the audience to please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom, but I'll go ahead and get us started. So jumping off from what was in large part your ending point there about the narration, that was one of my questions, actually. We were talking before the event started how I realized too late that I should have read the book. Normally I would have read the book in preparation for this event, but it didn't occur to me. Yeah, I apologize for being an inept moderator. But so a couple of questions about the book and if the movie is or is not trying to replicate certain elements from it. One is I was curious about the narration, and most specifically about kind of the strange echo effect that they used to record it. What is Preminger going for with that? And then sort of related and sort of not, I'm wondering if the book has the flashback structure that the movie has, to where like the black, obviously not in the book, the color wouldn't come into play, but in the movie, the black and white sequences are, like happening like in modern times, and the color sequences are in the past. So what's the structure of the book? And regarding the voiceover, is he trying to capture anything specific from the book, do you think?
So I looked up, so I read the book in French, and I read parts of it in English, just to see, like, I was curious about translations and how it was being perceived by an American audience. And one thing that is very obvious when you watch the movie, and I also read the book in one day and watched the movie immediately after I finished the book. So one thing that I very quickly noticed was how true Preminger was to the book, even in the text itself. He has this kind of old school thing about film adaptations. It's something that actually one of François Mauriac, the guy that I mentioned earlier, one of his books was adapted into a film, and there's the same situation in the sense that you have basically whole paragraphs from the book that are just told as a voiceover. And I think there's this, Preminger is really trying to keep the truthfulness of Cécile's account, but the images that he puts over these voiceovers are kind of, they're complexifying, I think, the book, in my opinion, but just in terms of like strictly speaking, he's very true to the book. I mean, there's like, I think like the first, I think the first paragraph is like pretty much, it's not copied, but there's a lot of elements that he kept. and throughout the book, there's a bunch of like I could hear some of the lines in French in the sense that I had read them right before. So I'm like, oh yeah, that's like basically verbatim. So I think that's an interesting point. Even though he added stuff and he modified some things, such as the names of the characters, he very much stuck to the text. And the book itself is so regarding the flashbacks, we don't have the exact same framing narrative where it's Cécile living her life. But what we understand from the very beginning is that it's something she wrote after the fact. It's her account, basically, the scenes of the parties that we see in black and white. They're just here to give kind of body to the frame narrative of this. But it's interesting to see also how the places where Preminger was most respectful of was truer to the original text was in those flashback moments, because we have a lot of like incursions from the narrator who tells who's kind of foreshadowing things or whatever. And these are basically passages that have been copied from the book and the film. Like every time we go back to black and white, it's something that the book has said very much verbatim.
Interesting. I guess that sort of, again, indirectly leads me to another question. So this is Preminger's second French film in a row. So he made Saint Joan, as you mentioned, which starred Jean Seberg. But of course, that's the Joan of Arc story. And then here he made Bonjour Tristesse, which is like a zeitgeist, the French novel of the era. But here he's making these films in English with, like a random girl from Iowa who'd never acted in films before his two films. So is he honoring this material, or is he bastardizing it? What does he have any business making these films in the first place, I guess is maybe what I'm asking.
I mean, I think it's something very easy to say retrospectively, but putting Jean Seberg in France just makes so much sense. Like, because then she was so like, even though, I mean, I will say though that there's this weird thing where, I mean, not weird, very understandable thing that happens a lot with, any American movie that is set in a foreign country, where you have the 3 or 4 main characters that are played by American actors and the rest are local actors. And the fact that Elsa, who's the kind of vulgar girl, who's played by a French actress, the fact that the girl who works for the family / girls, we don't really know how many of them there are, but there's a lot of them, they are French. And like all those side characters that are French, I think it's, and hearing them speak English with a very strong French accent can kind of be ridiculing in a sense, but also it's like, I mean, at least for me, it doesn't like scream, it doesn't add any realism to it. But in the meantime, I do think that it's a really good adaptation, and I'm not talking in terms of like being true to the source material, but just his interpretation is just really, really interesting. And I feel like the book itself could be set anywhere. It's not, I mean, some people will say, oh, actually the French, the English translation has typically French on the cover of the translation of Bonjour Tristesse. And I'm like, I mean, just because it's like people having sex or what, like, I'm just like, that's a kind of weird.
So you're saying they use typically French as a pull quote, like on the front of the book?
Yeah, it's like the big blurb on the quote. I'm like, and it's like scandalous, sunny, and typically French are like a bunch of adjectives, and I'm like, that's not typically French. I mean, it's a good novel that could be set anywhere. There's nothing specifically French about having such a fucked up, messed up, like family dynamic. So I just think it's a good adaptation, and it works for me.
To the point that it could be set anywhere. I was reading, I think the book was in print in 12 different languages by the time the movie was released. And the book had only been written in French, I think 4 years prior. So yeah, it happened very quickly and it caught on, worldwide almost. Again, to this point, based on what I was reading just earlier today, I didn't get to dig too deeply into it, so I'm sure you can poke holes in these theories. But when Bonjour Tristesse was released in America, it seemed like Americans were reasonably hostile to it at first. Like the initial reviewing press were not very positive. People had a bad taste in their mouth about Jean Seberg, who was viewed as being pretty bad in Saint Joan, and some people thought she was pretty bad in this. But then when Bonjour Tristesse came out in France, it was very embraced in France. Incidentally, Jean-Luc Godard said that Saint Joan was the 3rd best film of 1958. And it was Francois Truffaut who reviewed Bonjour Tristesse and Cahiers Cinema, but he gave it a very positive and frankly really misogynistic review, but he liked it a whole lot anyway. But do you have any theories or I don't know, like explanations of any kind why the French would have liked this strange American adaptation of a French novel and the Americans wouldn't? It seems like it would be the other way around, if anything.
I mean, I feel like, first of all, there's the kind of flattering aspect of having a French novel being adapted by a Hollywood director. I think that that plays also, at least in the interest that they may have in it. And also the fact that Preminger, long before Bonjour Tristesse, was already like, I don't know about like the popular reception because I'm very bad at this, but what I know about at least the way the Canadian cinema considered Preminger, they really liked him. They thought he was a very good director, and they one thing that is really interesting is how Jacques Rivette was obsessed with Preminger. Like he really thought that he was a great director, and he was a real fanboy. Like before he made any of his movies, he's the one who insisted on interviewing Preminger, and I don't think Jacques Rivette spoke very good English, but Preminger gladly answered the interview in like a mix of English and French. So they're really interested in him, and he was like he has this weird reputation among a lot of like French film people, whether critics at the time or filmmakers or both, where people saw him as both a studio guy and also kind of an auteur, but like he had such a, in terms of like, for instance, Jacques Rivette said that Preminger was an auteur, but he never explained why. Like he tried very hard to defend him, but without any grounds to it. So I think that they're just a natural fondness for him because he's a weird director in the sense that he doesn't really fit the definition of auteur, but he's also not completely like a studio guy. So he's just halfway between the two, and I think that's why so many French, at least, directors and critics liked him, because he was just unusual.
The first question from the audience actually is, again, on that specific point. This is from someone anonymous, so I'm going to spend the next few minutes trying to figure out, see if I can guess who the anonymous question asker is. But the question is, what does Victor think of Preminger as an auteur? How does Bonjour Tristesse fit in with that or not?
So I think it's complicated because, auteur, when you think of auteur theory, it's always the idea that they're dealing with specific themes, and it's hard to really see as like specific themes throughout Preminger's career. He has a distinctive filmmaking, like he has a distinctive like craftsmanship, I would say, in the sense that he, I talked about the long shots. There's the way he moves the camera. But it's hard to really see motifs as clearly as with other people who are more canonically referred to as auteur. But at the same time, he produced his own films, and he wanted to have his freedom to do exactly what he wanted. So I think there's still the thing to it, and the fact that he came from theater was also very influential to his thinking, like film-wise, so the way he thinks with the camera. So I don't know if I would say that he's like exactly the definition of an auteur, but I would not say that he's not. In the sense that I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, and he does have a very he does have a unique thing. He has this unique thing. When you watch one of his films, like you know it's him. You can feel. I mean, at least after Laura, you can feel he has a specific feel to it, the way he like kind of looks at characters, and he likes open spaces, and even the voiceovers or something he kind of likes. But in terms of themes, I think it's a little bit more complicated. It's not as clear. He has, I would say that he has more schematic and more form things. Like it's more a matter of like form. For instance, I talked about the family dynamics and stuff. Like he has these these elements that are not necessarily what you would expect from an auteur, but they're not something that they become so frequent that you cannot say he's not. So yeah, I would say he's both, is and not. It's no.
Well, he's kind of a tough case, in
Oh
large
yeah.
part because he seems to be able to do everything. Like he doesn't really have like a lane. Like he can work across all genres. He can work, like big studio films, small independent films. Just yeah, he's capable of pretty much everything. The same can be said of Howard Hawks, who the French New Wave directors did kind of build the auteur theory around. But yeah, he's interesting in that way. This is very limited. But of course, we started with Laura, and then last week we would have done Carmen Jones. We've got it coming 2 weeks from now, and now we have Bonjour Tristesse. So between those three Preminger films, I feel like you can identify a femme fatale, where Carmen Jones herself is a femme fatale, and then Cécile is a femme fatale here. I wonder how much that could be applied across like his larger body of work. But I'm trying to, like in real time, I'm trying to think of interesting things to tie it all together, and I'm sure it's there, but it's hard.
I think, yeah. So what I think it's, so I read an article today, and I noticed that someone was quoting what Fassbinder said about Douglas Sirk. So Fassbinder thought that Douglas Sirk was the best filmmaker alive, or greatest filmmaker ever, and he said that his films are so interesting because we see women think, and the author of the article was like, yeah, it's kind of like in Preminger, we see women think. I think it's, to a certain extent, it can be like what you were saying about the femme fatale is, even if we don't necessarily have the femme fatale in all of his movies, we we still have you know we still have always a weird female character, like a kind of they're a disrupting. I hate the word disrupting, but a kind of disrupting female character, in the sense that the one film that, it may be a hot take, but for me the one film that is the closest to Bonjour Tristesse is actually The Moon is Blue, where you have this professional virgin, and what is Cécile if not a professional virgin, who is trying to seduce a bunch of men at the same time, and she's very enterprising, she's very undertaking, she's kind of taking control, and I think that's one of the running themes across a lot of his movies is the women are always complex, they're always very layered, and even in The Man with the Golden Arm, which would be it would be very easy to overlook the female characters because you had Frank Sinatra playing a drug addict. But the thing is that Frank Sinatra's girlfriend in the film, she first appears as this weak woman who needs help, and it turns out she was just pretending to be in a wheelchair in order to keep Frank Sinatra, and she ends up having a very important role in the film, and she ends up being the villain of the film. So even if we don't really necessarily have this, like femme fatale definition that it would be very, it may be narrowing a bit, I think we do have. He loves having women that are very complex. They're never just a one-off thing. I think Whirlpool is also a very, very good example of that, where you have this woman who is questioning her sanity. And I mean, just the fact that he decided to have Joan Crawford in one of his movies is also very telling, because she is not only just one of my favorite actresses of all time, but also she is good at being this kind of extravagant like female lead.
I've got two more questions from the audience. No, three more. Take that back. Three more. Those of you at 7:59, unless you're in a hurry to go somewhere, Victor, we'll get through these three questions.
Yeah,
And
sure.
yeah, if anybody has any last minute burning ones, go ahead and type them in now. But it looks like these will probably be about the last three. So Jessica asks, you mentioned the ways in which Cécile and Raymond are connected and how their identities are intrinsically tied together. In the post-death scenes, Cécile and her father don't nearly have the same connection. Though they're technically united in guilt, shame, etc., they seem entirely disconnected in their trauma. Why do you think their reactions to Anne's death differ so much, and why does Cécile suffer so much more?
Well, this is a very interesting question, actually, because it's something that I thought about a lot today. I think so. We see them. In this apartment. They are disconnected from each other, but this apartment is very much a closed space. If you compare it to the mansion that is constantly open, and you have the camera moving in and out and out and in, and the camera is always moving around. There's no like, the inside feels like the outside because there's always an open window. And here in the like present time, they're kind of locked in this in this apartment. Like it feels like a prison. When I say adulthood is a prison, I mean it also in the kind of aesthetic sense that we have a form of prison. And I think that we also have very much the perspective of Cecile's character. Like maybe her father suffers a lot, but he doesn't show it. And I think it's also part of the unreliability of Cecile as a character is that she feels so alienated because she feels responsible, and maybe her father does too. But she doesn't really care about his feelings. She cares about him, about having him, about keeping this dynamic that they have. But at some point she tries to say that she cares about her father when she says when she's talking with Elsa and they start scheming around. She says, well, he's miserable because he's with Anne and she wants to marry him, and he said yes. And she doesn't really care about him. Like what she says that on a very light tone. What she wants is to arouse. She wants to arouse Elsa's jealousy, but she doesn't really care about her father's feelings. So I think they are from the very first, before even their trip to the French Riviera. I think they're disconnected in a way before even that, because their relationship is so weird that there's this illusion of connection. But I think that Cecile is such a young and unreliable character, and she's also traumatized that her father is not really her priority in a way. It's more her well-being.
We have a comment from Bethany Curtis, which you might want to comment on the comment. She says, the cafe scene with the conga line struck me as being very similar to Fellini's La Dolce Vita scenes in the hedonistic nightlife of Europe. I will point out, actually, in Truffaut's review of the film in 1958, he compared Preminger's work with Seberg to Fellini's work with his wife, Juliette Masina. Yeah, anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Victor. Do you have comments on the comments?
So I think, yeah, it's also very much part of this, this imagery that you have of Southern France, which is very much this place where rich people go to be rich and happy without, rich Parisians go there. And I think, it's very much, it's a scene that I think kind of at first, when you're in your first viewing, it's kind of it's kind of unsettling because it just takes such a big break. I mean, you have a musical number in the middle of the movie where people dance and sing, and it lasts a really long time. Like it's surprisingly long. And I think, yeah, it's kind of this, it's part of this, this this conception of the French Riviera. I mean, I went there when I was younger, and I was definitely not living in a mansion. I was, we were in the camping grounds. We had a tent and stuff. So, and the thing is, this kind of outdoor life, outdoor nightlife is very much part of. It's kind of sensationalizing the thing in the sense that it's very, a little bit exaggerated. But I think it's part of, this. I think you're right. It's very much like this hedonistic lifestyle about it's partying, it's dancing, it's sensual, and it's this kind of Orientalist vision because it's music that is I think not. I think it's not performed by white people, so there's probably this kind of Orientalizing thing of dancing to music that's a little bit exotic and like a bunch of rich rich people from Paris dancing to it. So yeah, it's very much the hedonistic lifestyle and kind of maybe poking fun at it too, because it's kind of a ridiculous scene. I liked it a lot, but it's a little bit ridiculous too.
Yeah, we all like ridiculous scenes. All right, so our last question, it looks like, is again from an anonymous attendee. I don't know if it's the same one as last time or not, but they say, do you think there's anything about the content of the novel that drew Preminger to adapt this novel in particular, or could it just be the popularity of the text?
I think, well, I think that Preminger definitely saw something. I will argue that even though it's a very reflexive novel, like there's a lot of thoughts about, there's a bunch of, she is talking, she uses this as a diary, basically. It feels like a diary, but there's a bunch of like very visual elements that are really taken back into the film. One example that I will use is when Anne comes up to Cécile and Philippe, and she decides to put an end to their relationship. At some point, Françoise Sagan says that Philippe kisses Cécile's shoulder before leaving, And it's an interesting image that is, copied into the film. So I think that I talked about the scandalous aspect. I talked about, the fact that it was something that Preminger was interested in. He probably read it thinking that Cécile would be, Jean Seberg would be a very good Cécile. And I think it's hard to read the novel without seeing Jean Seberg as Cécile, because she's just, she's a very good fit. But I also think that just, it may be a little simplistic, but I just think there's a very strong visual component to the novel. You have a lot of very strong images, and it's interesting how most of these images are, transferred back into the text. Of course, the dancing scene has been added, but there's all the party, and like, since it's a book that is so interested in looks, it feels like normal that he wanted to put it into movie. It's a book that was, unbeknownst to the author, I think it was made to be into the movie because it's very visual.
If you don't mind, just one last question of my own that you made me think of. It's a very simplistic one, but I'm curious, do you have strong opinions one way or the other about the quality of Jean Seberg's performance here? It seems like it has strong fans and strong critics.
Well, as a French person who lives in the US, it's very complicated to not have an opinion about Jean Seberg. What I'll say though is that when you see Saint Joan and when you see Bonjour Tristesse, not back to back, but when you have seen the two, I mean, you realize that Saint Joan is very much, her beginning. She's crying. She's very much, it's not her best work by far. And I think in Bonjour Tristesse, I just think she's convincing. I think it works. She is very childish. There's maybe some elements, and that comes just from reading the book. It's not just about Jean Seberg's performance, but more as I think a direction, like the actor's direction. It's more like Preminger's choices that I would blame for that. I think there could have been something a little bit more dramatic about her performance, maybe something a little bit, some passages, I mean, it's a very dramatic performance, but like there's some elements where I think, well, maybe he could have gone further. He could have gone more tragic, but it's not something that I wouldn't put the blame on Jean Seberg, because I think she's just so convincing at being this half adult, half child. Like there's something in the way her face shifts. She's able to, really constantly tiptoe on this limit, and I think she may be getting on some people's nerves because she may, seem a little annoying, but I think it's the character too. Like we are kind of forced to take everything she does and says with a grain of salt. So I think that I personally think it's a very good performance, and I understand why Jean-Luc Godard was so enthralled upon seeing her and wanted her in his movie so bad, because she is a good actress.
Well, that's pretty much my exact opinion. So thank you for vindicating me. And on that happy note, I guess we should wrap up. It's 8:09 somehow. Thank you so much. No, that's not a criticism. That's just means you're fun to talk to. It's all. But yeah, thank you so much, Victor. And everyone, please do come back. We've only got 2 more of these. Next week, Robert Garrick on Anatomy of a Murder, and 2 weeks from now, Renee Thomas Woods on Carmen Jones. But yeah, thanks, Victor. Thank you, everyone. And hopefully I'll see you next week.
Thank you.